When the Union made the call to fight during the Civil War, some blacks willingly answered the call, and they fought very hard on the battlefield. But there was another group of men who, for multiple reasons, wanted no part of the war, even though their freedom depended on it. And this made for a difficult time for recruiters, and they did not go without venting their frustrations, which we'll see in Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. It beginneth here.
Whether in the North or in the South, then, the prospects for Black Americans seemed inseparable from their military exploits. The way to the ballot box, into the classroom, and onto the streetcar was through the battlegrounds of the Confederacy.
Meaning blacks needed to fight if they desired civil rights, schools, and public accommodations.
The rifle and the bayonet, Douglass insisted, would speak more forcefully for civil rights than any
parchment guarantees.
War spoke louder than a paper claiming to give them rights.
Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States.
To learn the use of arms, moreover, was
to become familiar with the means of securing, protecting, and defending your own liberty. When it is once found that black men can give blows as well as take them, men will find more congenial employment than pounding them.
Meaning whites would be less likely to test them, essentially saying that bullies don't like victims that can fight back.
Once an advocate of non-resistance and only recently a major critic of President Lincoln for refusing to endorse emancipation, Frederick Douglass agreed in early 1863 to become a recruiting agent for the United States Army.
There is something ennobling in the possession of arms,
he told a meeting in Philadelphia.
And we, of all other people in the world, stand in need of their ennobling influence.
Military service strengthens courage, self-discipline, and self-respect. And the Negroes needed that more than anyone else in the world after coming out of 200 years of psychological destruction at that point.
Having undertaken the mission of enlisting blacks in the newly formed 54th Massachusetts Regiment, Douglass toured western New York seeking volunteers.
In Rochester,
he wrote in April 1863,
I have 13 names, my son heading the list.
That's how you know Mr. Douglass was serious about this cause. He was willing to make use of his own son in the war.
Employing both persuasion and strong-arm methods, the Army sought most of its black recruits in the occupied South.
Both tactics to get Negroes to join. They could either talk them into joining, which worked well for one group, or they had to use the strong arm method, which was the only option for the other group.
With
soul-stirring music and floating banners,
a correspondent reported from Maryland, recruiting parties would march through a neighborhood and
sweep it clean of its black warriors.
That's part of the strong-armed method. Troops swooping down like hawks on Negroes and sweeping them clean off the streets.
Wherever the Union Army was in control, recruitment offices were opened and specially designated agents, or raiding parties made up of a dozen men and a non-commissioned officer, were dispatched to the countryside to round up potential recruits.
Those were the swoopers, and they had to do this because most Negro men were not volunteering to go, and they were needed by the country at this point. But when they could be persuaded, this was unnecessary.
The usual procedure was for the agent to enter a town, address a hastily convened meeting of local blacks, tell them what the president had done for the colored people, display the attractive recruitment poster, and promise anyone who joined both financial and moral compensation.
That was the regular way of doing things.
Appointed to recruit black troops in northern Alabama, James T. Ayers found himself frequently forced to adopt direct personal pleading.
I want your man,
he told a black woman who had urged her husband not to enlist.
You ought to be a slave as long as you live, and him too if he is so mean as not to help get his liberty.
The Southerners have you trapped in the pit, and if you're not willing to help fight to get yourself out, then you actually belong there, right? This was his line of thinking.
Far more effective, in some instances, was the use of black soldiers to obtain additional recruits. Not only were black troops frequently dispatched with instructions to enlist any able-bodied slaves they could locate, but they might be necessary to protect the recruits from white retaliation. The black soldier also often appeared as the featured speaker at meetings of his people, and invariably he would appeal to the race pride and manhood of his audience.
Don't you remember how afraid they used to be that we would rise?
Jerry Sullivan asked a Nashville gathering in 1863.
And you know we would too, if we could. I ran away 2 years ago. Come, boys, let's get some guns from Uncle Sam and go coon hunting. Shooting those grayback coons that go poking about the country nowadays. Don't ask your wife, for if she is a wife worth having, she will call you a coward for asking her.
Applause and waving of handkerchiefs by the ladies.
They agreed with it.
The job of a recruiting agent in the South was beset with difficulties, frustrations, and personal danger. The whites regarded him as an incendiary. He proposed, after all, to arm black men, and slaveholders were naturally incensed by anyone who threatened to make soldiers of their laborers. Unless accompanied by a detachment of troops, both the agent and his prospective recruits might find it difficult to return to the nearest Union camp. In Kentucky, the provost marshal enumerated cases in which slaves had been whipped, mutilated, and murdered for trying to enlist, and recruiting agents had been
Caught, stripped, tied to a tree, and cowhided.
before being driven out of town.
This is wild, isn't it?
What made the work of the agent all the more exasperating was his frequent lack of success in obtaining many enlistments. The reports of white violence no doubt discouraged prospective volunteers, but this may not adequately explain the disturbing report of a federal official that in nearly 4 months of recruitment work, more than 1,000 men had been employed to enlist a total of 2,831 blacks.
1,000 recruiters enlisting just under 3,000 men is no good, especially under Civil War circumstances.
More likely, many blacks simply shared with their white countrymen an aversion to the hardships and risks of military service.
Which is a common human response because you could actually lose your life in this line of work. It is a major risk, and I was nervous when I volunteered to enlist in the Marine Corps. But I felt like I didn't have many other options, and I had to push past the fear and anxiety if I wanted a change. But it is absolutely normal to be scared.
The Negroes re-indicate their claim to humanity
An officer wrote from South Carolina.
by shirking the draft in every possible way, acting exactly like white men under similar circumstances.
Meaning blacks acted just like whites did by showing fear and not wanting to sign up.
He conceded, however, that the black conscript was less likely to desert than his white counterpart.
But once the blacks enlisted, they were less likely to run off than the whites. This is similar to what the Confederate officers said about the blacks who stood to fight while the whites took flight when they charged. These were their observations.
Some recruiting agents came away disgusted with the refusal of blacks to yield to their appeals. Initially enthusiastic about his recruiting mission in northern Alabama, James T. Ayers, who had been an anti-slavery Methodist preacher in Illinois, urged blacks to accept the responsibility for liberating their brethren from bondage.
Because Jesus wasn't going to do it. And this Methodist preacher knew good and well that that wasn't going to happen, which is why he urged the blacks to accept responsibility for liberating their brethren from bondage.
But his best efforts did not produce the results he had expected, and less than a year after his appointment, Ayers was a thoroughly disillusioned man.
He said this,
I feel now much inclined to go to Nashville and throw up my papers and resign, as I am heartily sick of coaxing niggers to be soldiers anymore. They are so trifling and mean. They don't deserve to be free.
They weren't signing up. For whatever reason, he couldn't get them to wear the uniform.
After making their way to the Union camps, many slave refugees eagerly volunteered for military service, believing that this act would confirm their freedom.
That's the other group of men. They had a different character altogether. They went themselves to enlist. Now, were they scared? You better believe they were scared, but they enlisted because they thought that this was the only way to get freedom.
The more reluctant blacks might be inducted anyway.
That's the other group. It's not like they're bad people or anything. It's just, they're just different, right? And although they didn't volunteer like other blacks, some of them found themselves still in the military. How?
It seems that pretty nearly all the refugees joined the army.
A federal official wrote from South Carolina.
You wish to know whether the refugees are kept in the guardhouse until they are willing to volunteer. I do not know whether they are kept confined till they do volunteer, but I know that they always let them out when they do volunteer.
They were probably pressured into serving. They were probably told that they were going to be kept confined until they signed the paper.
Increasingly, the Army resorted to forcible impressment,
which is forcing people to serve even if they don't want to.
Though in some regions they would try to balance the demand for recruits with the need to maintain plantation labor. The effectiveness of the recruitment campaign in the lower Mississippi Valley rested partly on the insistence that slaves who had left their masters should be forced to serve either as soldiers or as military laborers. The methods employed by officers in this region were often questionable, but they achieved spectacular results.
I bet they did.
The plan for persuading recruits.
One officer wrote from Memphis.
While it could hardly be called the shotgun policy was equally as convincing and never failed to get the recruit.
The commissioner entrusted with raising black troops in Maryland simply conceded that
no recruits can be had unless I send detachments to particular localities and compel them to volunteer.
Which is another way of saying force is the only way that worked.
Despite assurances to South Carolina blacks of voluntary enlistment, freedmen in the Sea Islands region stood in perpetual fear of raiding parties often composed of black soldiers, which descended upon communities and plantations in the dead of night to carry them away to nearby military camps.
Not a man sleeps at night in the houses,
A missionary teacher wrote,
except those too old to be taken. They have made a camp somewhere and mean never to be caught.
They ran off somewhere out in the woods. They weren't sleeping in those houses for fear that Negro raiders might swoop down and taketh them away to the military.
That recruitment had been progressing more slowly than expected was only one reason why General Hunter wanted to impress all blacks not regularly employed as officers' servants or military laborers. Military discipline, Hunter insisted, was the best way to lift these people to
our higher civilization.
The slaves, moreover, could never adequately appreciate freedom until they realized
the sacrifices which are its price.
And finally, he noted, the recruitment of black men made a servile insurrection less likely. In defending the conduct of impressment parties in Washington, D.C., a black resident singled out the contemptuous way in which some of his people responded to recruitment appeals. When asked to enlist, they would
make light
of the proposal and demand to know,
"What am I going to fight for? This is a white man's war,"
and accompany their response with verbal abuse.
This group didn't want anything at all to do with the war. They looked at it as being strictly white people business, and they would verbally abuse anyone who tried to change their mind and get them to enlist.
"Well now,"
the observer added,
"the colored soldiers think this is too much. They suffer enough at the hands of the white race without being buffeted by their own race, whose sympathies should be in their behalf."
They took the heat from both the whites and the blacks.
Although the Christian recorder had initially disapproved of the war and the resort to violence, it now urged black men to take up arms for their country and race.
Shame on him who would hang back at the call of his country,
the newspaper declared in supporting the efforts to raise a black regiment in Philadelphia.
Go with the view that you will return freemen. And if you should never return, you will die with the satisfaction of knowing that you have struck a blow for freedom and assisted in giving liberty to our race in the land of our birth.
Critical to the raising of a black army in the North were, in fact, the black recruitment agents. When Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts was authorized in January 1863 to organize a Negro regiment, he immediately recognized the far-reaching implications of his new responsibility. Since this would be the first black regiment raised in the North, he thought the success or failure of the effort would
go far to elevate or to depress the estimation in which the character of the colored Americans will be held throughout the world.
Although two companies were quickly formed in Boston and New Bedford, including black men whom the governor had been forced to reject at the outset of the war, there were insufficient numbers of blacks in Massachusetts to make up an entire regiment. The governor thereupon secured the support of a wealthy abolitionist who agreed to help finance the enlistment of blacks throughout the North, largely by employing as recruitment agents such leading black spokesmen as Martin R. Delaney, John Mercer Langston, John S. Rock, William Wells Brown, Charles Lennox Raman, Henry Highland Garnett, and Frederick Douglass.
We have a dream team together to go recruiting.
These were all familiar names in black abolitionism. Most of them had worked actively to eradicate racial discrimination in the North, and several of them had only recently endorsed immigration to Haiti or Central America before being dissuaded by the reality of an anti-slavery war.
Action, action, not criticism, is the plain duty of this hour.
Douglass declared, in a broadside intended to attract blacks to the Massachusetts regiment.
The iron gate of our prison stands half open. One gallant rush from the north will fling it wide open, while 4 millions of our brothers and sisters shall march out into liberty.
The recruitment drive was highly successful. By May 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the most celebrated of the northern black regiments, was ready to leave Boston for Hilton Head, South Carolina, where it had been ordered to report to General David Hunter. With some 20,000 cheering Bostonians lining the streets and the regimental band playing the John Brown anthem, the troops made their way to the Battery Wharf.
Come on with it.
Glory enough for one day, aye, indeed for a lifetime,
remarked William C. Nell, a veteran black abolitionist. Frederick Douglass was there, not only to view the results of his recruitment activities, but to see off his 2 sons, Lewis and Charles, who had been the first New York blacks to enlist in the regiment. Martin R. Delaney's 18-year-old son, Toussaint Louverture Delany, had left his school in Canada to join the regiment, and on the balcony of Wendell Phillips' house, overlooking the parade, stood none other than William Lloyd Garrison, who was observed resting his hand on a bust of John Brown. 2 months later, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment made its famous assault on Fort Wagner, a Confederate stronghold situated at the entrance to Charleston Harbor. The attack was repulsed with considerable loss of life. Robert Shaw, the white regimental commander, was among those killed, but black troops had fought valiantly, and that was what mattered. 2 days after the battle, Lewis Douglass informed Amelia Logan, his future wife, that he had not been wounded.
That's Mr. Douglass's son.
Men fell all around me. A shell would explode and clear a space of 20 feet. Our men would close up again, but it was no use, we had to retreat, which was a very hazardous undertaking. How I got out of that fight alive, I cannot tell, but I am here. Remember, if I die in a good cause. I wish we had 100,000 colored troops, we would put an end to this war.
With the successful organization of 2 Massachusetts regiments, the surplus of volunteers for the 54th became the 55th Massachusetts Regiment. Several northern states undertook to form similar contingents and employed black leaders to find the necessary men.
Which seemed like a good idea and should work, right?
The enthusiasm which brought about the Massachusetts regiments, however, proved to be less contagious than had been expected. Although several thousand northern blacks did respond to the call for military service, the anticipated stampede to the recruitment offices failed to materialize.
There was a group that did answer, but an even larger group of men that did not.
Before an opportunity was presented for them to do so,
a disillusioned black soldier told a gathering of his people in Washington, D.C.,
many of the black people were spoiling for a fight. They were ready and anxious to die for their race. But now where are they? What do you want Mr. Lincoln to do? Feed you on ice cream? Suppose these white men here were about to be drove into slavery. Wouldn't they fight? Certainly they would.
In their condition at that moment, yes. But not after 200 years of training to be dependent, submissive, and pushovers. They would have been just like the Negroes, but with the mind that they had at that time, the whites would have fought super hard to not go into slavery, right? You better believe that for sure.
But you would stand tamely and let your hands be crossed behind your back and told to go on darn near without resisting it.
That's part of the black consciousness they were forced to develop. And it had him furious that they would not move.
If this disgruntled soldier had looked around him, he might have perceived why some blacks had declined to enlist. The Civil War had expanded economic opportunities, and black people shared to some extent in the wartime prosperity. While a black resident of Washington, D.C., described a substantial increase in black employment, a white Bostonian was complaining that
the blacks here are too comfortable to do anything more than talk about freedom.
Pressure makes people move and create change. A comfortable person is content, and it's hard to get them to do anything outside of that comfort zone unless they're a really self-motivated person. This Bostonian man claimed that the blacks in Boston at that time were too comfortable to do anything more than talk about freedom.
Nor did northern blacks feel as intensely that inducement of freedom which moved their southern brethren to enlist in far greater numbers. Some insisted that they could serve their race more effectively if they remained at home, where important campaigns also needed to be waged.
Now, this would be a valid reason for some of them.
I am pleased to learn that you were fortunate enough to escape the draft.
William H. Parham, a black school principal in Cincinnati, wrote to a prominent Philadelphia black leader,
"As I believe you will be able to do more for the race where you are than you could by going to the battlefield. When this war is over, the next struggle will be against prejudice, which is to be conquered by intellect, and we shall need all the talent that we have among us or can possibly command. Then will be your time to be found in the thickest of the fight, where the battle rages fiercest, and the danger is most imminent."
All completely valid points for him not to join the war.
When Parham himself was enrolled under the Conscription Act and thereby made subject to the draft, he searched desperately for some way to avoid military service.
"Many have escaped the enrollment,"
he wrote,
"but I am not one of the fortunate ones. If I am drafted, I do not think I shall go."
Aside from his obvious reluctance to serve in the army, Parham had heard discouraging reports that black soldiers were not being accorded the same pay, bounties, and treatment as white recruits,
which we'll hear about on That Which Cometh Up. And with that being said, I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.